Today, I want to share 3 unsettling stories about forbidden places and the people who crossed the line and went there anyway. These are the kinds of stories that linger in your mind long after they end. So, let's not waste time and dive straight into the first one. Late in the afternoon, around 4:45, on February 11th, 1995, a 50-year-old man named Eric Tollett was sitting alone in his office inside the furniture factory he owned in Northumberland, a quiet, rural region in the north of England. The building felt isolated, almost cut off from the rest of the world. From inside his office, the only sound Eric could hear was the heavy rain pounding relentlessly against the roof. A powerful low-pressure system had settled over the area, triggering an intense thunderstorm. The weather had become so severe that Eric made the decision to shut the factory down for the day, sending all of his employees home so they wouldn't have to travel in the dangerous conditions. Eric felt relieved that he was finally in a position to do something like that. Years earlier, this would not have been possible. He had purchased the factory 16 years before, pouring every bit of his savings into it, scraping together whatever money he could, just to make the deal happen. And buying the building was only the beginning. Afterward, it needed extensive renovations before it could even function as a furniture factory capable of producing and selling goods. But after 16 years of relentless effort, the business was thriving. Losing a single day of production no longer felt like a crisis. Eric wasn't worried about missed profits. Instead, he used the quiet time to catch up on paperwork and enjoy a slower day with the people close to him. His girlfriend, Leslie, was there with him, spending time in the office as the storm raged outside. Meanwhile, Eric's brother, Donald, had taken Leslie's 8-year-old son into the garage attached to the factory so they could pass the time and play. As Eric flipped through documents at his desk and Leslie stood by the window watching the rain, the calm was suddenly shattered. The office door flew open and Leslie's son rushed inside. Donald wasn't with him. The boy looked terrified. Before Eric or Leslie could even ask a question, the child blurted out that Donald had collapsed in the garage. At first, Eric didn't know what to think. His brother was 60 years old and had struggled with health problems before. Hearing the word collapsed sent a jolt of fear through him. At the same time, he wondered if the child might be panicking, if something minor had been misunderstood. But whatever the explanation, Eric knew he couldn't hesitate. He dropped everything. Together with Leslie and the boy, he rushed down the hallway toward the attached garage. Because the garage was connected to the building, they never had to step outside into the storm. They ran straight inside. And when they reached the garage, Eric immediately saw Donald lying motionless on the floor. Before Eric rushed to his brother's side to see what was wrong, he suddenly stopped in the doorway. He turned to Leslie and her son and spoke quickly and firmly. He told them to go back to his office and call emergency services right away, saying he would be there as soon as he could. Without arguing, they turned around and hurried off. Eric immediately spun back, ran into the garage, and dropped down beside Donald. Almost instantly, Eric realized something was terribly wrong. His brother wasn't breathing. As Eric desperately searched for any sign of life, panic flooding his thoughts, he suddenly felt an overwhelming pressure clamp down on his chest. It was sharp and intense. Within seconds, everything went black, and Eric collapsed onto the concrete floor beside his brother. Years earlier, long before Eric ever owned the building, this place had served a very different purpose. It hadn't been a furniture factory at all. It was once a coal processing facility. Attached directly to the structure was a coal mine, where raw coal was pulled up from underground and handled inside the large warehouse. When Eric purchased the property 16 years before, he was aware of the mine and the sealed entrance connected to the building. But the mine had been inactive for years. The entrance had been completely boarded shut, forgotten, and left untouched. It seemed harmless, irrelevant, and played no role in his day-to-day life. What Eric didn't know was that over the many years the mine sat abandoned, a deadly gas known as choke damp had slowly formed deep inside. It remained trapped below ground, unnoticed and undisturbed. On that stormy day, the powerful low-pressure system outside caused those toxic gases to rise. They forced their way out through the sealed mine entrance and crept into the attached garage. The invisible fumes filled the space, turning the entire room into a silent death trap. Donald never had a chance. He died from poisoning. Eric, after collapsing, came dangerously close to the same fate. But he was pulled from the garage in time. He later regained consciousness in the hospital, having narrowly survived. Years later, on the morning of September 10, 2022, a 68-year-old woman named Diana Stewart stood on the deck of a small boat drifting in the Pacific Ocean, less than a mile from the eastern coastline of New Zealand. The sea was calm, the water a pale shade of blue, stretching endlessly in every direction. As Diana gazed across the horizon, she spotted an albatross gliding smoothly through the sky. She raised her camera and captured the moment. Diana was a seasoned wildlife photographer and an active member of a nature photography group in New Zealand. Along with 9 other members, she had joined this boat for a special trip focused on birdwatching and photography. Up to that point, the experience had been everything they hoped for. For 2 hours, they sailed peacefully across the water, photographing rare birds and marine life. They had even been fortunate enough to spot a couple of whales in the distance. It felt like a perfect day on the ocean. By this point, the outing was coming to an end, and the group had begun heading back toward the shore. As the boat moved steadily across the calm water, Diana stayed alert, scanning the horizon for any last chances to capture something special. She continued searching the sky for birds when her attention was suddenly drawn downward, toward the water itself. Something massive was moving just beneath the surface near the boat. It appeared to be gliding in their direction at an angle. At first, she couldn't tell exactly what she was seeing. Then, as it rose closer, the shape became unmistakable. It was an enormous whale, and it looked like it was about to pass directly underneath the boat. Instinctively, Diana lifted her camera, preparing to take the perfect shot. But in the next instant, everything went wrong. Instead of slipping beneath the vessel, the whale slammed into the side of it. The impact was violent. The boat lurched sharply, tipping onto its side, and before anyone could react, Diana and the others were thrown into the freezing ocean. The moment Diana hit the icy water, her life jacket automatically inflated. The cold was unbearable, instantly disorienting her. Nothing about this situation felt real. As she broke the surface and tried to understand what had happened, she realized she couldn't see anything at all. Darkness surrounded her in every direction. The noise was overwhelming. The only sound she could hear was the roaring engine of the boat, echoing loudly through the water. As she reached her hands upward, it became clear what had happened. The boat had flipped over and come down on top of her. Somehow she was trapped beneath it, suspended inside a small pocket of air. She began shouting for help, her voice swallowed by the noise of the engine. She tried to twist and push her way out from under the curved underside of the overturned boat, but every attempt failed. Her fully inflated life jacket worked against her. She couldn't deflate it, and the buoyancy prevented her from diving down and escaping. Diana was trapped. The water around her was painfully cold, cold enough to cause hypothermia in under 30 minutes. The engine continued to roar. Everything was chaotic, loud, and terrifying. Fighting panic, she forced herself to breathe slowly. As she reached out in the darkness, gasping for air, she realized she wasn't alone. Other people were trapped under the boat as well. She felt their movements, heard their frantic attempts to communicate. Everyone was terrified. She had no way of knowing if anyone was injured. With no other option left, Diana began pounding on the underside of the boat, hoping someone above the surface would hear her. She needed them to know that people were trapped below and desperately needed help. And when she started knocking, she wasn't doing it in vain. There were people outside the boat, survivors who had been thrown clear into the water. All 11 people on board had been thrown into the water. 6 of them were not trapped beneath the overturned boat. 5 others, including Diana, were pinned underneath it. As Diana continued pounding desperately on the underside, the boat's skipper, a man named Mark, heard the knocking clearly. He was one of the 6 who had avoided being trapped below. Mark was in serious danger too, just like everyone else in the water. But his situation was far less dire because he wasn't stuck under the boat. Almost immediately, he understood what had to be done. First, he needed to gather the 6 people who were with him and make sure they were still alive and conscious. Then, he had to figure out how to rescue the people trapped underneath. His first instinct was simple. He began banging back on the hull, sending a signal to those below that they had been heard. But the situation was absolute chaos. A whale had just flipped their boat in the middle of the ocean. No one knew if the vessel might sink at any moment. The engine was still running, creating a deafening roar. The water was ice cold. This was a genuine fight for survival. Despite everything, Mark forced himself to stay calm. He kept hitting the side of the boat, trying to reassure the people trapped underneath that help was coming. Below the surface, however, panic was setting in. For Diana and the others, breathing was becoming more difficult. The air pocket was small, the water around them constantly shifting as they moved. They swallowed water between gasps, struggling to stay conscious, slamming their hands against the hull again and again, begging to be pulled out. From time to time, some of them tried to force their way out from under the boat, but it was useless. Their inflated life jackets made escape nearly impossible. The only way out would have been to remove them entirely, and that choice came with terrifying risks. There was no way to know what obstacles waited beneath the boat, whether they had the strength to swim free, or what would happen if someone got stuck below. Faced with those unknowns, the group had no choice but to wait and keep signaling for help. Above the surface, Mark and the other 6 climbed onto the overturned boat. It was large enough that their added weight wouldn't want to force it deeper into the water or make things worse for those trapped underneath. Mark's priority was clear. He had to get these people out of the freezing water as quickly as possible to prevent hypothermia. Once everyone was on top of the hull, Mark realized that one of them still had a working cell phone, even after being submerged. He took it immediately and called emergency services, telling them they needed help right away and that people were trapped in the water. The response was urgent. Help was already on the way. Authorities arrived surprisingly quickly. They managed to bring Mark and the 5 others who were clinging to the overturned boat to safety. After that, divers were sent into the water to search beneath the vessel. They found the 5 people who had been trapped below, including Diana. They were all still there, but none of them were alive. What made this even more disturbing was the cause of death. They hadn't frozen. They hadn't drowned. When the whale struck the boat and flipped it over, several gasoline lines ruptured, and as the boat sat upside down, fuel leaked directly into the air pocket where they were trapped. Fuel was leaking from the damaged gasoline lines, and with the boat flipped upside down, that fuel drained directly into the small pocket of air beneath it. The space where they were trapped was already dark, freezing, and deafening, but now it was slowly filling with toxic gasoline fumes. There was nowhere for the fumes to escape. 17 minutes after the boat capsized, all 5 people beneath it died from gasoline poisoning. On Sunday, November 6, 2022, a 21-year-old man named Yevgeny Titov stepped out of his home in a small city called Jagiellovsk in western Russia. He got into his car and drove north for roughly an hour and a half before pulling into a parking lot and stopping. From there, he got out and walked several blocks to a nearby train station. At the station, Yevgeny approached the ticket counter and asked when the next train to St. Petersburg would be leaving. He was told one would depart shortly. He bought a ticket, sat down, and waited. When the train arrived, he boarded, found a seat, and settled in. For the next 43 hours, Yevgeny barely moved. St. Petersburg was roughly 1,000 miles away, and for nearly 2 full days, he simply sat there, doing nothing. He hadn't brought food, luggage, or supplies of any kind. All he had with him was his wallet. He waited in silence until the train finally reached its destination. Late on the night of Tuesday, November 8th, Yevgeny calmly stood up, exited the train, and left the station. What happened next isn't entirely clear. He may have taken another train, a bus, walked, or accepted a ride from someone. What is known is that he traveled about 15 miles south of the station to Pulva Airport, in St. Petersburg. But when he arrived at the airport, he didn't attempt to board a flight. Instead, he made his way to a very specific parking lot located outside the terminal. Several hours later, in the early morning darkness of Wednesday, November 9th, a passerby was walking through that same parking lot on the way to the airport when they heard something strange. It sounded like distant, muffled screaming. At first, they dismissed it. Airports are noisy places. Maybe it was a child or someone joking around. Nothing about it seemed urgent. But as they got closer, they noticed an open manhole cover. And that's when they realized the screams weren't coming from the crowd. They were coming from inside the hole in the ground. The voice belonged to Yevgeny. For reasons that still aren't fully understood, he had removed the manhole cover and climbed down inside. He descended deep underground until he reached the bottom, a wide vertical chamber where a person could stand upright. Branching out from that space were several underground pipes, stretching away into darkness. Once Yevgeny reached the bottom, he made a choice that still defies explanation. He selected one of the underground pipes branching out from the chamber. The pipe was barely a foot wide, a tight, suffocating cylinder that disappeared into complete darkness. It looked endless. Without hesitation, he lay down and began crawling into it headfirst. In total darkness, inch by inch, he forced himself deeper inside. He crawled nearly 40 feet before his body finally became stuck. With every movement forward, he was wedging himself tighter, locking his own body in place. This wasn't a pipe that narrowed over time. It was narrow from the very beginning, and he pushed into it until there was simply no room left to move. In the early hours of Wednesday, November 9th, Yevgeny realized he was trapped. That was when he began to scream. Those screams were what led the passerby to the open manhole above. Emergency responders arrived and descended into the underground system. After many exhausting hours and the use of specialized equipment, they managed, almost unbelievably, to pull Yevgeny back out of the pipe alive. He was rushed to the hospital with severe injuries. His skin had been badly damaged from grinding himself deeper and deeper into the rusted metal. He had also suffered gas poisoning and hypothermia. But against all odds, he survived. In the aftermath, authorities opened an investigation. There was no clear motive, no explanation for why he traveled such a long distance, why he chose that place, or why he crawled into that pipe. When Yevgeny had fully recovered and investigators questioned him, his answer was simple and unsettling. He said he had no memory of any of it. And that's where these stories end. If these stories stayed with you, if they made your heart race or your thoughts linger, take a moment to share what you felt in the comments. And if you want more stories that dive into the dark, the dangerous, and the unexplained, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next.